How's it going, everyone? It is I, Anime Outlet, and this is part 1 of What If Deku Turned into a Nomu. And now, let's begin. Izuku Midoriya, son of Inko Midoriya and Toshin Yagi. Inko would be holding her there smiling down as Toshinori Yagi, otherwise known as his hero name All Might, would be staring down at his son. He now has sort of an heir to his quirk, at least if Izuku wants to become a hero and to save people just like he had wanted to. So, as All Might would be staring down at him, he would immediately get a call saying that he has to go do hero work. No one in the doctor's office knew that it was him, as his just real identity had been kept a secret all throughout his time as a hero. So he would stand up, bid his wife farewell before running off to go do hero work somewhere else to save lives. As Inko would frown down that her husband wasn't there to see his own child's life for more than 5 minutes. But that's hero work for you, and he's at least going to save people for the common good, or for the greater good, that is. So she couldn't really be too mad. 4 years would now pass, as All Might is just absent from Izuku's life entirely. All Might had decided to just not break things up, but he decided it would be best if he were to live on a different location, so to not warn or just hurt the lives of Inko and his child, Izuku. He didn't want to threaten their lives in any way, so he knew he couldn't live with them. If he were, villains possibly might find them and use them as hostages and possibly kill them just to strike back at All Might. And so All Might knew it was for their better, so that they were to live separately. Inko wouldn't really like this decision, but she was okay with it, as long as they're still alive, and All Might comes to visit them from time to time. So with that, we now see a young Izuku Midoriya at the age of 4 running around his house as today is his birthday. "It's my birthday, it's my birthday," he would yell, rushing around the room, as his mother would be seen walking down the steps to go look the child. "Calm down, Izuku, calm down," she would say, trying to calm the energetic boy, as Izuku would rush over to her, yelling, "Can we go to the quirk doctor? I can't wait to see what quirk I have." He would yell, jumping in the air, pumping his fist, just yelling he couldn't wait to become a hero, and he couldn't wait to see what powerful quirk he had. He just couldn't wait. He had tons of All Might merchandise, as All Might was his favorite hero. He wanted to be like All Might so bad, and so he wanted to see what his quirk was, so that he could know he was going to be another All Might. He was going to be someone that everyone looked up to and just wanted to be saved from. He was going to save millions of people, at least that's what a young Izuku had thought. So Inko would get everything ready before grabbing the young boy's hand, pulling him into the car, setting him down in his car seat, as they would then drive off to the court doctor's office. As Izuku could be generally just sitting in his chair, bouncing around with tons of energy, the doctor would walk into the room holding a clipboard. "An Izuku Midoriya," he would say. Izuku's name, along with Inko's, had been changed just to hide their identity even further. Inko was kind of suspicious about all of this, but her husband was All Might, after all. So with that, Inko would be taken, along with Izuku, into a small private room where the doctor would perform some tests, as he would then come back moments later. Sadly, there's no good news that I have to share with you. This may be tough to hear for young Izuku along with you, Inko, but Izuku Midoriya, you don't have a quirk at all. You're quirkless, the doctor would say, as the cold words of the doctor would pierce right through Izuku's heart, shattering his dreams into millions of tiny little pieces, as Izuku would stare on in utter shock. He couldn't believe it. "I'm quirkless? What?" Izuku would say, just staring off into space as the All Might figure he was twirling around in his hand dropped to the floor, as one of the arms would just break off, as Izuku would stare down at the figure as tears would start coming out of his eyes. He would look up smiling towards his mother, just staring on towards her. I could still become a hero, right, Mom? Izuku would say, stuttering towards her, as she would look on down towards her own child, not sure what to say. Should she tell him the truth, or should she lie to him? Either way, she'd feel guilty afterwards about her answer. She just didn't know what to say. As the doctor would then leave the room, saying that they can now go home and that he has nothing else that he can tell them. Inko would reach down as Izuku would grab her hand tightly, as she would then drag Izuku to the car, setting him down as they would then drive off. Izuku would ask to see one of the All Might videos he loved watching of him saving tons of people, as Izuku would just be staring at the screen as Inko would come in as tears were flowing out of her eyes. She would hug her child, just endlessly mumbling to herself, repeating the same words. "I'm sorry I failed you, Izuku," over and over and over again. As Izuku would look on towards his mother, just completely heartbroken at what his mother had been saying to him. She had just didn't make any sense. Izuku, a 4-year-old child, just had his entire world completely crumbled within his grasp. And now his own mother's saying that she failed him. Izuku just couldn't comprehend everything that they were saying. It just didn't make sense to him. As we now cut to see the doctor closing out his shift, walking into a strange warehouse after parking in a completely just abandoned location. All for one, I think we found the perfect test subject to begin with the full-scale testing, or those experiments I was talking to you about, the doctor would say on towards All for One, who would smile down towards the doctor. "Oh, you think you found the perfect test subject, do you? Do you mind explaining to me what this subject is and who they are?" "Their name's Izuku Midoriya, a recently announced corkless boy that I've just tested today, actually. See, now that we've tested a few of these projects on a couple of other people and found some quite good evidence of things we shouldn't be doing, but we all tested on people that already had quirks. I have a superstition that someone who's quirkless could possibly have a limitless potential. We could give them limitless amounts of quirks." All for One would stare intently on at the doctor, who continued on rambling on, just in fascination about what he could do with all these experiments that were just kept up inside his mind. So All for One would continue on. "Now, can you tell me who this boy is again?" "Oh, it's Izuku Midoriya." "Midoriya? That name kind of sounds familiar. You remember All Might's family, correct?" "I remember just seeing about them after one of the research teams found out about his true identity. Toshinori Yagi. Of course, I've known that from the beginning, but I didn't bother finding out if he was married at all. And just so happens he is, to Inko Midoriya, and he just so happens to have a son, Izuku. Oh, imagine the look on his face when he finds his rival, the villain he's been trying to defeat all of his life, just happened to turn his only son into a villain, into a Nomu, a brainless thing going to tear him down from the inside. It's perfect," All for One would say as the doctor would then smile towards him. "So, I guess we're agreed on this. Now we just have to find out how we're going to kidnap him, do we?" The doctor would say as All for One would nod his head. "Alright, so, let's start making up a plan then, shall we?" All for One would say as the doctor would nod their head. As All for One would be doing this, we now cut back to see Izuku just sleeping up in his bed, staring up at his ceiling, as all of the stars just star stickers that would glow at night were just staring on down at Izuku. So he was just staring right up at him, like his dream was all the way up there and had just fallen down. As one of the stars would fall down right on him, hitting him square in the head. So Izuku would only pick it up before flinging it across the room. So he would just calmly shake his head before falling back to sleep, just completely confused. He didn't know what to do anymore. Of course, he was still a young child, so he didn't know how to react as much as he possibly would have if he were to be older. So, with that, I'll cut to see a few days later. We see Izuku walking into school as all of the students would be surrounding Bakugo Katsuki, who had recently just awakened his quirk, as pops and all of this tiny crackles would come out of Bakugo's hands flying as sparks would go everywhere. He had recently awoken his explosion quirk, so he would marvel down at it. Izuku would stare at them before many of them would ask Izuku, since he had recently turned 4, what his quirk is, asking if he had awoken it yet, or if it has awakened yet. However, Izuku would shake his head as tears would start forming up into his eyes, just saying, I don't have a quirk. At least that's what the doctor said. My mom said there's still a small chance that I'll get a quirk later, though. Many of the kids would stare on towards the optimistic Izuku, as many of them would just burst into laughter. Oh, please! You know once the doctor says you're quirkless, there's no chance of you getting a quirk. Stop all of that mumbling, Izuku. You know you're quirkless forever. Bakugo was the lead in this attack, just laughing at the powerless, useless Izuku, saying that he was destined for failure now, not having a special power like the rest of them. As Izuku would stare off in complete shock, as all of the friends he had built up had just started eating into Izuku, as he could feel himself falling down into a dark abyss as he just didn't know what was happening. That night, when he was returned back to home from the bus, dropped off, Izuku would walk into school telling his mother about the things they had said, as his mother would start crying, saying that they aren't true, that he isn't useless. However, all of a sudden they would hear a knock on the door as Inko would go over, reaching for the doorknob, opening it, as a silver-haired figure would walk into the room, staring down at Inko, as Inko would stare up at him, just confused. Hello? Who are you? She would ask, however, there would be no response, so the figure would reach out their long arm, grabbing her head before throwing or tossing her across the room, as she would slam into the wall, creating a small dent, as the figure would walk on towards Izuku. Ah, there's little Midoriya, the figure would say as Izuku was now cowering back, completely scared and frightened about who this was. They had just hurt his mother, after all, as they would reach down, picking Izuku up as he would start struggling, crying, yelling out for someone to help him. However, the sudden hand would be placed over his mouth, holding it tight as to no sounds would come out of it. As Izuku would be taken away from his mother, she would be staring on, shock, reaching out, yelling for Izuku. However, Izuku couldn't do anything to stop it. He was far too weak. He didn't even have a quirk to defend himself. As all of this would be happening, this silver-haired figure would bring Izuku down and sit him down into a dark room after going into a portal. As the torture would begin, as the doctor would be the head of it, completely breaking down Izuku and building him back up, just molding him into what he wanted him to be. 10 years of this would end up passing, as all it took was just around 2 weeks to break Izuku fully, to the point where he just couldn't do anything anymore. He had lost his mother, and his memories of her had already started to fade after 2 weeks. Izuku was, after all the bullying he had faced that first day, he had already been broken enough, but now this doctor taking him away from his mother, breaking him down, and just completely destroyed him, as Izuku was now no better than one of those mindless Nomus. However, Izuku still had his thoughts. He could still think to himself. However, he just was broken. He didn't know what to do anymore. So the doctor would build him back up, giving him different types of quirks at just the word of All For One, as All For One had given Izuku a hyper regeneration quirk, as they would start to test it, just injuring Izuku in certain ways, watching it as it would heal back. As this would be happening, Izuku would feel all the pain as it would start to heal, as the doctor would walk into All For One's office. So, All For One, what do you plan on giving, like other types of quirks to the Midoriya? He would say, talking as if Izuku was just sort of an object and not a living being, as All For One would stare down at the doctor before thinking. Well, we already have a hyper regeneration quirk on it. We could possibly give it a shock nullification type of quirk, along with a strength quirk. That would make it one of, like, all the other Nomus, though. You said this one's different, didn't you? All For One would say, questioning the doctor, as the doctor would nod his head vigorously. Oh, yes, this one, I think, has the most potential out of all of them. Remember, it's quirkless, after all, the doctor would say, as All For One would nod his head. Okay. Do you think we should focus all of our attention and moves on it, making it sort of one of these super Nomu, having just a bunch of quirks and using it as a day-to-day object, basically? All For One would say, as the doctor would think for a moment before nodding his head. Oh, yes, we could possibly do that. It wouldn't have any limitations due to his quirklessness. At least that's what I believe. But it still could. Remember, we've only given him one quirk after all. We just have to see what happens after giving him a second and third quirk. The nullification could possibly help his regeneration, though, possibly nullifying the pain, so that the regeneration could possibly go faster without the limitations of him screaming all the time. All For One would think for a moment before nodding his head. Okay, why don't I give him some of the quirks now? Alright, let's go ahead and try it. All For One would walk on towards the child before placing his hand on Izuku's head, as he would instantly transfer in a bunch of quirks into him. A warp type of quirk that could open up portals, a lightning quirk that allowed you to throw thunderbolts, a strength quirk along with a shock nullification quirk, the same shock nullification quirk and strength quirk that they were going to give to the USJ Nomu. However, the Nomu project had now had the Midoriya in it, as All For One would transfer into them before walking off. Why don't you allow Midoriya to go ahead and play with the other Nomus? It'd be quite the training exercise, don't you think, Doctor? All For One would say, as the doctor would question All For One's word before agreeing to it, letting Izuku into the Nomu room, telling the Nomus to attack Izuku, and to not stop until Izuku had defeated them all. As Izuku, being pushed in there, would stare up just all at the Nomus. All of the fear he had faced in the 2 weeks had completely been gone. His emotions had been completely broken, and he just didn't have them anymore. He was just emotionless. So blank stare would form on Izuku's face, looking up at all of the Nomus, would then stare down at Izuku before rushing at him. These Nomus were not perfected at all, as they had still been prototypes after all. Izuku was sort of a passion project for the Doctor and All For One, the first perfected Nomu. However, they forgot to do one thing in their torture. They hadn't made sure Izuku had lost all of his free will. Izuku still had the free will, and so he could still think for himself. But the 4-year-old, after being scared for 2 weeks, just decided that he should go along with everything that these people said. And so Izuku would do this, completely decimating all of the Nomus as they would try to attack him. However, Izuku, now with his newfound quirks, would start to experiment, just throwing lightning bolts all around her, punching these Nomus, as Izuku would tear them to shreds, getting sort of joy out of all of this. It was the one thing that made sort of Izuku happy, as he had nothing else that was fun. This was the only thing. Sure, it wouldn't be fun to normal 4-year-old Izuku. However, Izuku had just been left sitting in a dark, abandoned room and had only seen like 3 people through 6 years of all of this. And so Izuku finally got something to do. And so, Izuku would finally just do all of this. And just destroying the Nomus is when the doctor and All For One walked in. They would be completely satisfied with what Izuku had managed to do. It looks like he's ready. But do you think you should give him sort of an intelligence quirk? The doctor would ask as All For One would look on towards him. An intelligence quirk, you say? What do you mean by that? All For One would say, questioning the doctor, as the doctor would just sort of laugh. Oh, you know Shigaraki, your apprentice of yours. Quite the rash one he is. What if he gives Midoriya sort of a dumb order that could possibly get Shigaraki along with this project that we've already spent 6 years on in danger? And possibly killing them or getting him captured, allowing for research from the heroes. He should at least have some intelligence not to obey stupid orders from Shigaraki. I suppose you do have a point. Shigaraki is quite the one to act out on his own anger. Alright, so we give him an intelligence quirk. I'm sure it can't be too bad. All For One would say, reaching down, giving Izuku another quirk, adding to his ever-growing collection. As For One would then just look down towards the doctor. I'd suppose that'd be the limit. I don't think we should do anything else. It might just become brain dead after that. And we don't want all those quirks to go to waste. As once they go brain dead, I can't get the quirks back. So let's just leave it at that. All For One would say, as the doctor would nod his head. Okay, fine. I guess this Nomu has reached its limits, hasn't it? The doctor would say as All For One would nod his head. We now see Izuku walking back over towards wherever he was supposed to be, as the doctor would stop him. Whoa, Midoriya, where do you think you're going? You should probably use your portal quirk to get to the bar. You remember me showing it to you. It's our main location, after all. Why don't you go ahead and use your portals? Izuku would open up a portal in front of him as both the doctor and Izuku would step right through it, as they would now be at the bar or the main villain location. Who all that sat there was a younger Shigaraki, who, remember, still older by a bit than Izuku, so he would be sitting there and would then see Izuku walk in. Who's this? Shigaraki would say, not having been just introduced to Izuku, as the doctor would say, oh, this is Izuku. He's just going to be here to make sure that nothing stupid happens or silly. Think of him as your protector, after all, Shigaraki. Shigaraki would stare on towards Izuku, as Shigaraki would then just say, okay, just make sure they don't get in my way if I'm trying to do something. The doctor would then just nod his head. You hear that, Izuku? Doctor would ask towards Izuku, would blankly stare at both Shigaraki and the doctor. All right, he would say. It was one of the first times he had ever spoken in the years he'd been with the villains. As another 4 years would end up passing with Izuku practicing with his quirks, getting better and better at them, as he still was human, but he had just been twisted by all of the torture and pain and suffering that he had gone through, causing him just not to act like one, but he still looked just like one. However, there were scars littering his body up and down from being injured by some of the Nomus or with his regeneration quirk training. So, with all of that happening, we finally end up seeing Shigaraki talking to Izuku, who was fixing him just a glass of water, putting ice in glass before giving it to Shigaraki. Alright, Izuku, are you ready to finally go attack Yue? Izuku would stare on towards Shigaraki before answering. Oh, yes, of course. Well, finally to use my quirks instead of just being on those stupid, brainless Nomus, Izuku would say as Shigaraki would just sort of laugh. Oh, I can't wait. I can't wait for you to kill that stupid number one hero, too. I know you've been training quite hard for you to do that, haven't you? Shigaraki would say as Izuku would just nod his head. Think it's going to be quite easy. Heard All For One had managed to injure him some years back. So let's just hope All Might's just quite a bit weaker than what those sources say, with him being stronger than ever after all. It's just so stupid, Izuku would say, as Izuku had been with the villains so long that his entire just thought process, all of the times he said he wanted to become a hero and save people, and his mother, his father, they'd been completely forgotten about. Izuku no longer remembered who those people were. All he knew was the fake story that All For One had told him. It wasn't actually fake. All Might was his father, and he had abandoned Izuku, and that's when All For One found Izuku, the abandoned person. Since that heartless All Might had decided to abandon his family along with him, Izuku, and All For One had came by and saved Izuku from just being cast out and left on the streets as a homeless child. So Izuku would start to hate the hero world. How could the number one hero abandon such a child? It just didn't make any sense. It was so stupid of him, all just to not be held back and be just destroyed by the media for having a child. Izuku would hate All Might for this and start growing the hatred that Shigaraki had as well, to kill All Might. And so the training would continue with Izuku now having a goal after everything that had happened. As after just a year with Izuku being in the villains, Izuku would have completely forgotten about his mother, and after just around 10 years, there was no traces of even that memory still in Izuku. He just completely forgot about it, like it was snapped out of his brain entirely. It just didn't exist to him. You ready, Izuku? Shigaraki would say on towards Izuku as he would just nod his head. Today is finally the day that All Might stops existing, Izuku would say, cracking his knuckles before creating a portal in front of Shigaraki, as they would then go to a warehouse that housed tons of villains, thousands of them even. As Izuku would create a massive portal, all of them would start filing through the portal as Izuku and Shigaraki would step through at last. Kurogiri had no need to be created because there was just no need for another person with a warp core. Izuku already had one. As Izuku creating it, both Izuku and Shigaraki would stare on towards just All Might, or not All Might, the UA students, as all of them would be staring on, as Aizawa would tell all of them to stay back, as he would jump down before starting to defeat all of the villains there, just beating them one by one, at least trying to. However, Izuku would create a portal beneath him, as he would end up making it right up towards where all of the students of UA were standing. As Izuku would be standing there, he would blend in perfectly. However, many people would start to realize, who is this? Hello, UA students. It's a pleasure to meet you all. I'm Izuku, Izuku would say, as that name would strike right through the head of someone that was there. A Bakugo Katsuki. He remembered that name, Izuku. It was the name of a kid that went missing like 10 years ago or so. He would think, as Izuku would just be standing there in front of all of them. It's nice to meet you all. It's also nice to say that many of you will probably either be injured today or won't make it out of this USJ, or whatever this building happens to be. So, I wish you all luck on your endeavors, Izuku would say before creating a portal beneath all of them, as many of them would try to jump out of the way. However, it was too late, falling directly into the portal below, as they all just disappear into it, being spread out throughout the different zones. Izuku, using his intelligence core, had even told Shigaraki it'd be smarter if they just did more research and planted people with the right amount of quirks in a certain area, and did research on the UA students even, and placed them in their zone that they'd be the weakest in. As Izuku would be saying this, Shigaraki would have nodded his head at this, but this would be months back, and so that planning had already happened, and so all of that had happened already as well. And so with that, there would just be villains there to compensate for the villains or heroes that just didn't do so well with their quirks in a certain area, like Suyu Asui in the Fire Zone. So Izuku would be just warped back to wherever Shigaraki was, as he would see Aizawa had defeated the entire horde of villains already. Using his quirk and just other people's quirks against the crowd, he had managed to defeat almost 1,000 villains. As he was now coming straight for Shigaraki, before he could do so, Izuku would step in his way, slamming both of his hands down into Aizawa's head before picking Aizawa's head up and slamming his knee right into Aizawa's stomach before throwing Aizawa right across the USJ, slamming him into the stairs that were directly behind him as Aizawa would look up trying to get up as he would see Izuku coming right towards him, where he would stop right in front of him, winding his hand back as a thunderbolt would be directly in Izuku's hand as he would throw it right into Aizawa, as he would make direct contact, electrocuting Aizawa, just knocking him out completely. As Izuku would look around, just standing there with Shigaraki as minutes would end up passing, as villains would end up returning back to the middle with just unconscious UA students there, as Izuku would end up creating a portal before teleporting them where a villain in a warehouse would tie them up and just put them somewhere else in a just warehouse where they're going to be housed, just to try to get them to turn into villains or other sorts of things like Nomus. The villains that had been taken were unknown towards Izuku and Shigaraki at that moment. So as 20 minutes within the USJ would end up passing, they had captured 5 students and brought them back to a certain warehouse to be just determined what they are going to do with them. As all of a sudden the doors would be smashed open as there lied All Might, just not smiling at all, as he would stare down at Izuku, just in the center of the USJ, along with Shigaraki, as Izuku would then yell up towards him. "Ah, father! We finally meet!" Izuku would say, and that is where I'm gonna leave this What If off, everyone. I hope you all did enjoy part 1 of What If Deku turned into Nomu. I thank you all for watching. Part 2 is coming out tomorrow, or if it already came out, there's going to be a link in the description, or not in the description, in the comment section that will go right to part 2. So I thank you all for watching once again, and goodbye.